Okay, I mentioned in another video that I'm going to be reviewing John Whittaker's book called Flintknapping, but it's going to take more than one video to do it. Okay, this is just the introduction. Now, John Whittaker goes into fairly good detail in various aspects of flintknapping, right? But I think, from my perspective, in general, the book is outdated. Okay, it's still a useful tool for exploring flintknapping, but I think there's going to be some issues in the book that are going to cause, especially new flintknappers, to stumble. All right, now, in general, the book is fine. Okay. And I'm not criticizing John Whittaker's decisions of what to put in the book or his writing style. I'm going to be criticizing things that I disagree with purely in terms of flintknapping technique, okay? And maybe some of the terminology. Like I don't agree with the use of the term bending, flaking, or bending flakes when I describe any type of flintknapping, okay? Now, it's taken me about 2 weeks to go through about half the book, as far as highlighting areas that I need to discuss and writing notes in the margins so I can do the videos. It's going to take more than one video, okay? Maybe 3 or 4, who knows? It'll take me another 3 weeks to get through the rest of the book. 2 weeks or probably, maybe not that long. I am going to skip over some of the parts in the book. There are parts in the book that go over techniques discussed in European sources. Let's see. Yeah, Brief History of Flintknapping, Chapter 3 has a lot of stuff from Europe. I'm going to be skipping a lot of that, mainly because that kind of stuff updates itself and criticizes itself, you know, especially in terms of other authors. So I'd rather stick to stuff that I know both firsthand and also that I don't think other people are updating. Okay. Now, why he decided to include European type of flintknapping discussions in this book, I don't know. Maybe just to fill it out more. So. But that's probably not fair. I wouldn't have done that personally because it automatically makes your book obsolete. You know, why would you put perspectives from other authors basically into your book? Anyway, in general, since this is just the introduction, I think the book is outdated. Not criticizing his flintknapping ability or anything like that. It's just with the flintknapping that I do and the perspective that I have, I don't really use the techniques in here very much, or the descriptions or the analysis in the same way that he does. Okay, and one example is when he discusses pressure flaking and putting your tool on the edge, your knapping tool on the edge of the biface and knapping that way. I completely disagree with that assessment. The tool has to be at least partly on the face of your workpiece. Sometimes only on the face. All right. Now, if there's a notch in your flintknapping tool, which is fine, or if your flintknapping tool is spongy, it'll kind of wrap the edge, or the notch will sit in such a way that it's below the edge or on the edge. okay, part of that notch, but you're going to have at least part of your tool on the face. All right. Now with the notched or soft tool, isn't that flaking off the edge? Isn't that using the edge itself to cause a flake to happen? In my opinion, no. That's not the reason why you've got a notch or a soft tool. Okay, first of all, most of your force in most flint knapping applications is going to be downward from the face or the surface of your workpiece. And when you put force in that way onto the face, you're going to initiate a crack on one side or both sides of your tool. Okay? That's your goal. You want to create you want to initiate a flake crack, not where your tool sits, but somewhere on the outside, on either side or one side, and then they'll wrap around to the other. Okay? That's where you want the fracture to initiate. You don't want the fracture to initiate anywhere within the area that you are applying force. And that is exactly what happens when you try to flint knap on the edge. You have to be up on the face. And wrapping around with a soft tool helps to preserve the edge. Okay, so it doesn't cause any type of initiation within the area that you're applying force. Okay, you know what I mean? Now, when you have a notch, what is a notch for? Isn't that to pry the edge? No, you don't want it to pry on the edge. The notch is so that it will assist inward pressure or a shear force. Okay, that's something else that most flint knappers don't go into. Okay, they go into, you know, the angle of force and the amount of force. They don't go into the different types of fracture mechanics or the different terminology that's used in fractures. Okay, most flint knappers go into what they call conchoidal fracture terminology, which to me is not useful whatsoever in flint knapping. I know that's a harsh statement, but the conchoidal fracture only explains the initial fracture within the material. It does not explain the propagation through the material. It only encompasses the fracture that happens around the platform and into the bulb of percussion. But once you get past that initial fracture, the propagation is extremely variable, and it is not explained at all by conchoidal fracture. Okay? And in flint knapping, the conchoidal part of the fracture is insignificant to us. We want what happens after that. We want the long flakes. We want the flakes that are patterned in a certain way as they come off, like very little ripples, or maybe we want ripples on the flakes. Maybe we want a wide flake. Maybe we want a narrow, long flake. We are not concerned with the conchoidal fracture in the beginning in practical terms. Yes, we are concerned with it in terms of initial force, initial application of force, but after that is when the real flint knapping takes place. So conchoidal fracture, a discussion on conchoidal fractures, to me, is useless. All right, and that's something in the book too. In all discussions of flint knapping, you have this conchoidal fracture brought up. Okay, and that's something that I disagree with as far as teaching people how to flint knap. Another thing in the book that I might criticize is the well, I won't get into depth. This is just the introduction. Like I said, I think I've said that already. So what my approach is I'm going to be using a critical approach, which means I'm going to be only criticizing it and not supporting what I agree with, both in terms of, you know, being brief, and also because science works that way. Science works and advances with criticism. It does not advance or work with support. Okay. Then it also makes a shorter video. I agree with the book more than I disagree with it, right? So the criticism is going to be shorter, just logically. And I'm only going to go over the areas that I think are egregious, which aren't very many, but there are some, okay? And I want to get it right. That's what's taking me so long. I want to get that particular thing right in terms of how I approach flint knapping. Now, it's all going to be biased according to how I flint knap, all right? And as you've noticed, the way I flint knap is different than many other flint knappers. I do a lot of freehand. I don't use pads on my leg. I use small hammerstones, undersized hammerstones in a lot of cases. I don't swing when I hit with a baton on the actual workpiece. I used to swing it like a bopper, but now I don't swing that. I swing my wrist and my arm instead. Or I should say I swing the hand a little bit and the arm instead of swinging the actual billet. I hold it closer in. You'll see that in my videos. I have other techniques. My pressure flaking has always been pretty bad as far as technique. I'm getting better now. I'm exploring the pressure flaking technique aspect more now because I think it's vital in some applications. Some points can only be replicated with pressure, right? Certain flint knapping styles can only be replicated with pressure or a combination of pressure and percussion. Okay, so I'm getting into that. But as far as the way I'm criticizing it, I'm using my own perspective, my own style, and it's different from, I guess, an old-timer style of knapping that is described in this book. When I got into knapping, this has been since 2009. Before that, a lot of guys were in a very rigid type of format where you would use ishi sticks, copper tips, large precursors, swinging billets, large leg pads, and plastic tarps, sitting up high with a chair up high to do their knapping. Huge number of tools on the side. You got a big old toolbox of tools. What I try to do, I try to limit the number of tools that I use. I've always used a canvas drop cloth. I think cloth is a lot better, and it's catching on. I use freehand techniques. I don't use leg pads. I don't use long shafts for my flint knapping, or large boppers, or large mallets, or anything large or long. Everything I use is compact, pretty straightforward. Mostly, I prefer to use horizontal punches for indirect percussion instead of vertical punches for indirect percussion. That's different than most flint knappers. I like to use undersized billets, undersized hammerstones, I should say in quotation marks, because there really is no set rule, but most guys will use a large billet, a large hammerstone, a little bit oversized for what they need, just so they can have more of a momentum behind it. I think that's the mentality there. I don't use, or I ignore support under the workpiece as I'm flint knapping. If I'm using support, it's unconscious. I don't pull on the workpiece in any way or apply special forces or back it up into my hand in a certain way when I strike. I try to use the mass of the actual workpiece against itself instead of using my hand as something to augment it. Although I do use my hand as an added weight. I do sometimes hold or grip the workpiece very hard when I'm striking, but that's only with very tough materials. Usually the weight of the workpiece is sufficient to resist the extremely fast impacts that I generate, which is another aspect of my flint knapping that's different. I prefer speed over weight. Okay? The way I knap, I accelerate the amount of speed instead of decelerate. I also try to increase the amount of opportunism that I use. And instead of shaping the workpiece to my technique, I adjust my technique to the workpiece, which is opportunistic. All right. Also, a lot of flint knappers don't discuss shear forces. I don't know if I mentioned this already. They don't. I don't know if it's because they're not familiar with it or they just don't bother with it. Shear forces are extremely important in flint knapping, especially when you consider something like bipolar percussion, where you have a very rigid anvil, heavy, and then you smack the workpiece on top to create a longitudinal split of the core or the nodule or whatever, okay? It's not a fracture that opens up the crack. It's a shear fracture, which slides, okay, different halves of the workpiece, okay? Like if this side is up higher, when you strike, it'll move it this way and it'll cause a shear fracture, which is that's what's happening with bipolar percussion, okay? And that's what happens also with flakes that you want to remove with a notched tool. You're trying to increase your inward pressure to cause a shear fracture, okay, to produce a longer flake. That's what we want in flint knapping. We want long flakes, and with long flakes you need to know how to create the shear force. Even though you don't know what it's called, the shear forces are what cause long flakes, okay? For me, in my opinion, flint knapping is about shaping the surface of your workpiece, not the edges. Primarily, you're concerned with shaping the surface. And the cross-section is important as well. Thinning is manipulating the surface so you can get a thin cross-section. You don't shape the edges to get a thin cross-section. You may shape the edges to prepare for thinning, but the main aspect of flint knapping, for what we use it for, is surface shaping. What's happening on the surface of your workpiece? And for that, shear forces are extremely important, which isn't discussed in many of these flint knapping books or forums or other places. But I use it constantly in my flint knapping, and I'm aware of it. And maybe it's my engineering background, but with fractures, I'm concerned with mainly shear forces. And tying it back to what I was saying before, the speed in which I flint knap is geared toward generating that type of force, a shear force. Once you have thinning down, the shaping around the outside, including the notches, is pretty straightforward. Small flakes. You can use about any technique or tool for that. You're not really doing the meat and potatoes of flint knapping when you're working around the edges or when you're doing the notching. Although there are specialized techniques for that sort of thing. The main thrust, from my perspective, is shaping the surface of your workpiece. Okay, I think that I've repeated that enough. So yeah, short flakes around the edges and short flakes for notching are trivial. And sometimes conchoidal fracture can describe that, but especially when you have pop outs when you're doing notches, then yeah, we're discussing these little insignificant types of results. Okay, what we really want in flint knapping is, first of all, to establish a good workpiece, a good preform, and then we can shape the edges and do the notching, or do the base, or whatever else we need to do with the workpiece itself. And there are specialized techniques for notching and for sharpening and for shaping the outside and for creating platforms along the edge. But that's all secondary. A lot of these books, including this book here, make those issues primary, which I disagree with. I think I mentioned before that my technique is opportunistic. I'm looking at what I can modify on the surface by opportunistic striking along the edge. Okay, Now, it can be argued that I don't prepare the edges well enough to create the surfaces I want. Yes, that's probably true. Either it's because I'm impatient or some other thing. But yeah, that's my bias. I tend to knap opportunistically, and I don't always get good results on the surfaces of my tools, and I may not be following the clues that artifacts are leaving as to how they were made, since I go straight to try to get large bold flakes and that sort of thing. They may not be the way it was actually done, or it might be, who knows. Anyway, without getting too far into a tangent on how I flint knap, I will be doing more in-depth analysis and criticism of this book in more videos. It'll take me a while, so there might be a pause between this video and those videos, but hopefully that'll be out soon. Okay.